You need to move now, or I will arrest you! I am not moving!
I haven't done anything wrong!
He thought the badge made him untouchable, until the real badge walked in. The sound of metal cuffs snapping shut echoed across the wet pavement as Officer Daniel Brooks stood frozen, his breath uneven, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off his stunned eyes. A moment ago he had control. A moment ago he was the one giving orders. Now his hands were behind his back, and the crowd that once watched in silence leaned closer, phones raised higher, capturing everything. The shift was instant, brutal in its clarity, but how did it happen? How did a routine stop spiral into this? Rewind just 5 minutes earlier. The parking lot was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels too still, too watchful. A black sedan pulled into a dimly lit spot, engine humming low before shutting off. Ava Carter stepped out, composed, deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. She didn't rush, didn't look around nervously. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be, but from across the lot, Daniel Brooks was already watching, leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. Something about her didn't sit right with him, or at least that's what he told himself. Maybe it was the car, maybe it was the confidence, maybe it was something he couldn't explain, but the decision formed quickly. He pushed off the cruiser and approached, his boots striking the ground with purpose. "Ma'am," he called out, voice firm, carrying authority that demanded attention. Ava turned, calm, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone even, controlled, and for a second, just a second, something flickered in his expression, uncertainty, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by a smirk. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer, "there might be." And just like that, the air shifted, tension creeping in, invisible but heavy. The kind you can feel in your chest before anything even happens. A couple walking nearby slowed down, glancing over. Sensing it too, Ava didn't move, didn't step back. She simply stood there, steady, as if she'd seen this moment before, as if she already knew how it would end. But Daniel didn't see that. He only saw what he wanted to see, and in his mind, he was still the one in control. Daniel Brooks stopped just a few feet away from Ava Carter, close enough to see the faint reflection of the flashing cruiser lights in her eyes, but not close enough to understand what he was actually looking at. His posture stiff, his tone sharpening as he circled slightly to position himself between her and the vehicle. "I am going to need to see some identification," he said, each word measured but laced with suspicion. Ava did not reach for anything right away. She simply held his gaze. Calm, steady, the kind of calm that did not come from confidence alone but from experience, from knowing exactly how moments like this unfold. "Of course," she replied, her voice even, almost quiet against the distant hum of traffic. But something about her tone seemed to irritate him, as if her composure challenged the authority he expected to dominate the situation. His jaw tightened. "Let us make this quick," he added, glancing briefly toward the car again, the expensive finish catching the streetlight in a way that made his suspicion grow stronger rather than fade. A few more people had slowed their pace nearby, not close enough to interfere, but close enough to watch, the kind of silent audience that forms when tension becomes visible. Ava slowly reached into her bag, every movement deliberate, unhurried, not a single gesture wasted. And for a moment the entire space seemed to narrow to just that motion. The sound of fabric shifting, the faint tap of her fingers brushing against leather. Daniel's eyes followed closely, his stance adjusting, his hand hovering near his belt, ready, reactive, prepared for something he had already decided might happen, even if there was no real reason for it. Ava pulled out her wallet and held it in front of her, not extending it yet, just holding it, as if giving him the choice to step forward, to take control, or to pause. And in that brief hesitation, something subtle shifted again, something almost invisible, but powerful. "Go ahead," she said softly, and Daniel stepped closer, reaching out, but before his hand could fully take it, she opened the wallet herself, revealing the badge inside, clean, unmistakable, the letters catching the light for just a second. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words sat there between them, undeniable. But instead of stopping, instead of reassessing, Daniel let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that carried more disbelief than humor. "That is a good one," he said, shaking his head slightly, his voice louder now, enough for the nearby onlookers to hear. "You expect me to believe that?" Ava did not react. Not with anger, not with frustration, just that same steady gaze, as if she had already heard this response before, as if she had already counted on it. The crowd shifted again, whispers starting to form, curiosity mixing with uncertainty, and Daniel, sensing their attention, straightened slightly, his confidence growing in the presence of an audience. "I have seen fake badges before," he continued, his tone now edged with certainty, as though repeating it made it true. "You are going to need something a lot more convincing than that." Ava closed the wallet slowly, the motion quiet but deliberate, and for the first time, she tilted her head just slightly, studying him, not as a threat, not as an obstacle, but almost as a question, like she was trying to understand how far he was willing to go. "Officer," she said, her voice still calm, still controlled, "you should listen carefully." But he did not. He had already made his decision, already committed to the version of reality he believed in, and behind him, his radio gave a faint crackle, barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of sound in the background, easy to ignore, but not for long. The faint crackle from Daniel's radio grew sharper, more defined, but he barely glanced at it, his attention still locked on Ava as if proving her wrong mattered more than anything else in that moment. The crowd behind him shifting again, a few more people stopping now, phones raised, recording, capturing every word, every movement, the air thick with anticipation. "I am going to ask you one more time," Daniel said, his voice louder, firmer, projecting control not just for her but for everyone watching. "Step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Ava did not move immediately, not out of defiance, but out of precision, every second measured, every reaction intentional. She slowly lowered her wallet to her side, her eyes never leaving his, and there was something in that look now, something deeper than calm, something that hinted at certainty, the kind of certainty that does not come from hope, but from knowledge. "You are making a mistake," she said quietly, and for a split second, the words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than they should have been, but Daniel shook his head, dismissing it with a short breath. "No," he replied. "I am doing my job." The radio crackled again, louder this time, a voice trying to break through the static, urgent but still unclear. "Unit 12, confirm your location." Daniel reached up and pressed the button without taking his eyes off Ava. "I am on a routine stop," he responded, his tone clipped. "Controlled. Possible impersonation. I have it handled." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to feel unusual, just long enough to create a flicker of doubt that he quickly pushed aside. Ava exhaled slowly, not a sigh, not frustration, just a steady release of breath, and then she spoke again, her voice still even, still composed. "You should listen to your radio." But he did not. Not really, he heard it, but he did not process it, because processing it would mean reconsidering. And reconsidering would mean admitting that something about this situation did not fit the narrative he had already built in his mind. Behind him, one of the onlookers whispered, "Is that real?" Another voice answered, "I do not know." And the uncertainty began to spread, subtle but growing. Like a ripple moving through still water, Daniel took another step forward, closing the distance just slightly, reinforcing his position, reinforcing his authority. "People try this all the time," he said, half to Ava, half to the crowd, as if explaining himself, justifying what was about to come next. Fake credentials, fake stories, hoping no one checks. Ava tilted her head just a fraction again. That same quiet observation, that same unspoken question, "How far will you go?" The radio burst to life once more, this time clear, sharp, cutting through everything else. "Officer Brooks, stand down immediately." The voice was firm, unmistakable, and for the first time, Daniel's expression shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to register something new, something unexpected. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, everything began to change. The crowd sensed it before he did. The tension snapping tighter, sharper, the kind that comes right before something breaks. "Repeat, stand down." The voice continued, now unmistakably urgent. "You are engaging with a federal agent." Silence followed. Not complete silence, but the kind where every other sound fades into the background, where even the rain seems to slow, and Daniel's grip on the moment, the control he believed he had, began to slip, just slightly, just enough. The words hung in the air like a warning that had come too late. You are engaging with a federal agent. And for a moment Daniel Brooks did not move, did not speak, his mind caught between what he had just heard and what he had already decided to believe. The rain tapping steadily against the pavement, the distant hum of traffic continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Ava Carter did not shift her stance, did not raise her voice. She simply watched him, patient, composed, as if this exact moment had already played out in her mind long before it happened. Daniel's grip on his authority tightened, not physically, but mentally, the kind of tightening that comes when someone feels control slipping and tries to hold on anyway. That is not possible, he said, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice lower now, less certain, the confidence from moments ago beginning to fracture at the edges. The radio crackled again, sharper, more urgent. Officer Brooks, confirm. You understand the order, stand down immediately. The tone was no longer suggestive. It was direct, unmistakable, and the crowd felt it, the shift moving through them like a quiet wave, whispers growing louder, phones tilting for a better angle, capturing the hesitation that had replaced his earlier certainty. Ava finally moved, not away, not in retreat, but just enough to close the distance by a single step, controlled, deliberate, her presence steady. You still have time to correct this, she said, her voice calm, not threatening, not emotional, just factual, and that made it heavier, made it harder to ignore. Daniel's eyes flickered between her and the badge she had already shown, the image replaying in his mind, the details he had dismissed now, forcing their way back in, the clarity of the lettering, the way she had held it without hesitation, without performance, and behind that, something else began to surface, something he had not accounted for, the possibility that he had misread the entire situation, but admitting that, even silently, meant undoing everything he had just asserted in front of an audience, meant stepping back in front of the very people who were now watching him, waiting, judging. The radio voice returned again, this time even closer to command than warning. Federal units are en route. Do not escalate. And that was the moment it became real, not just a possibility, not just a doubt, but something tangible, something moving toward them. Ava's gaze did not change, but there was a quiet certainty in it now, the kind that does not need to be spoken, because it is already unfolding. Daniel took a small step back, almost unnoticeable, but enough to signal that something had shifted. The line he had drawn was no longer as solid as he believed. The crowd noticed, of course they did, the subtle change, the hesitation, the break in rhythm, and their whispers sharpened into something more focused, more aware. Ava lowered her hand slowly, not as an act of defiance, but as a reflection of the moment changing, of the control returning to where it had always been, just hidden beneath the surface, and in the distance, faint at first but growing clearer, the sound of approaching engines began to rise, steady, deliberate, undeniable, and for the first time since this encounter began, Daniel Brooks realized that whatever happened next was no longer his decision. The sound of engines grew louder, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but approaching with purpose, with weight, the kind of presence that does not ask for permission, and as it filled the space, the entire atmosphere shifted again, this time completely. Daniel Brooks stood there, no longer advancing, no longer speaking, his shoulders tense, his mind racing through every possibility, every explanation he could hold on to, but none of them felt solid anymore. None of them held the same certainty they had just moments before. Ava Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if the unfolding moment was simply catching up to what she had already known from the start. The crowd leaned in further now, their whispers no longer quiet, no longer unsure. There was a tone to them, a recognition, something happening that they did not want to miss. Phones lifted higher, capturing not just the scene but the shift in power that was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel glanced briefly toward the sound, toward the direction of the incoming vehicles, dark silhouettes beginning to take shape under the streetlights, moving fast but controlled, and for the first time, he did not look like the one in charge. He looked like someone waiting for something he could no longer stop. His radio came alive again, but this time he did not respond. He only listened, his jaw tightening as the voice repeated the command with unmistakable authority. Maintain position, do not escalate. The words echoed in his mind, not as guidance, but as confirmation that this situation had already moved beyond him. Ava finally lowered her hands fully to her sides, not in surrender, not in relief, but in quiet ownership of the moment. Her gaze never left him, not accusing, not mocking, simply present, and that presence carried more weight than anything he had said earlier. The vehicles pulled in with precision, tires gliding to a stop, doors opening in sequence, figures stepping out with calm, deliberate movement, their posture alone signaling a different level of authority, one that did not need to be announced, one that was simply understood. The crowd parted slightly, instinctively making space, their attention locked on what was about to happen next. Daniel took another small step back, almost unconsciously, his earlier confidence now replaced by something else, something closer to realization. One of the approaching agents moved forward, his expression focused, his pace steady, eyes scanning the scene before settling on Ava. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone respectful, direct. And in that single moment, everything that had been questioned became undeniable. The title, the identity, the truth that had been dismissed just minutes earlier. Daniel's breath caught slightly, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to mark the shift inside him. The line he had held on to breaking completely. The agent turned his attention toward Daniel, his expression firm but controlled. "Officer, step aside," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive, and Daniel did, slowly. His movements no longer sharp or commanding, but measured, careful, as if every step carried weight now, as if every action was being seen for what it was. The crowd watched in silence, the earlier tension now replaced by something clearer, something final. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, stepping forward just enough to stand beside the agent, no longer the focus of suspicion, but the center of authority, and for a brief moment, her eyes met Daniel's again, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty that said everything without needing words. This moment was never going to end the way he thought it would, and now, it was no longer his moment at all. The moment settled into something heavier than silence, not empty but full of eyes watching, full of meaning shifting in real time. Daniel Brooks stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of control, but still inside the consequences of what he had started, his hands hovering uncertainly at his sides, no longer issuing commands, no longer directing the scene, just present, and that presence felt different now, smaller somehow, less defined. The agent beside Ava Carter moved with calm precision, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, every motion measured, the kind of control that does not need to raise its voice to be understood. "We are going to review this interaction," he said, his tone even, but firm enough that it left no space for misunderstanding. Daniel nodded slightly, almost automatically, as if his body responded before his mind could fully process what was happening. The crowd remained fixed in place, their attention unbroken, some lowering their phones for a second only to raise them again. Unwilling to miss the next shift, Ava took a slow step forward, not toward Daniel, but toward the center of the moment, reclaiming the space that had been taken from her minutes earlier, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, and yet the energy around her had transformed completely, no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but recognized. The agent glanced toward her briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, one built on trust, on shared understanding, on something that had been in motion long before this encounter began. Daniel's radio crackled again, but now it sounded distant, irrelevant, like an echo from a situation that had already passed. He swallowed slightly, his throat dry, his thoughts catching up all at once. The badge, the voice on the radio, the arrival of the federal units, each piece aligning into something undeniable, something he could not step away from. "I did not realize," he began, his voice lower now, lacking the sharp edge it carried before, but the words did not carry weight, not anymore. They felt incomplete, insufficient against the reality standing in front of him. Ava turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him again, her expression steady. But there was something different now. Not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity. The kind that comes when the truth has already revealed itself and there is nothing left to argue. "That is the problem," she said quietly, her voice calm but precise. "You decided before you understood." The words landed without force, but they carried impact. Not as an attack, but as a reflection, and Daniel felt it, not physically, but internally, the shift settling deeper, the weight of the moment becoming unavoidable. The agent stepped forward again, his focus returning to the process, to what came next. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone unchanged, "we will need you to come with us to clarify the details of this encounter." It was not a threat, not a punishment spoken out loud, but it carried finality, the kind that closes a chapter whether someone is ready or not. Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not resisting, just absorbing, just understanding that the control he thought he had was never really his, and now it was completely gone. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and took a step forward, not as the authority, but as part of the process he had triggered. The crowd shifted again, their energy changing from tension to realization. The story they had been witnessing now complete in a way they had not expected. Ava remained where she was, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and as Daniel moved past her, their eyes met one last time. Not with hostility, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something deeper, a moment of recognition, of consequence, of truth finally standing where it had always belonged. And in that moment, the balance of power was no longer a question, it was a fact. Daniel Brooks walked forward slowly, each step measured, not because he chose it that way, but because the moment demanded it, because everything around him had shifted into a space where speed no longer mattered, where control was no longer his to claim. The federal agents moved with him, not forcing, not rushing, just guiding, their presence enough to define the direction. The crowd parted further now, creating a clear path, their earlier curiosity replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. Whispers turned into low murmurs, fragments of realization passing from one person to another. "She told him," someone said softly. He did not listen. Another voice answered, and those words hung in the air longer than anything else. Ava Carter remained behind for a moment, watching as the scene unfolded without her needing to step into it again. Her role in this moment complete, not because she had taken control, but because she had never lost it. One of the agents paused briefly near her, offering a small nod, not formal, not exaggerated, just acknowledgement, and she returned it just as simply, the kind of exchange that did not need explanation. Daniel's shoulders felt heavier now, not from anything physical, but from the realization settling in, the weight of every decision made in the last few minutes, every assumption, every word spoken with certainty that no longer existed. He glanced once more toward Ava, almost instinctively, as if trying to find something to hold onto, something that might reframe what had just happened, but there was nothing left to reinterpret, no angle that changed the outcome. Only the truth standing clearly where he had refused to see it before. The agent leading him slowed slightly as they approached the vehicles, turning just enough to speak. "We will go over everything step by step," he said, his tone calm, professional, but carrying a quiet finality. Daniel nodded again, this time more deliberately, accepting what he could no longer avoid. Behind them, the parking lot began to shift back toward normal, but not completely, not fully, because something had happened here that people would carry with them, something they had witnessed in real time. The shift of authority, the exposure of assumption, the quiet but undeniable return of balance. Ava finally turned toward her vehicle, her movements steady, unhurried, as if the moment had never disrupted her, as if this was simply one point in a much larger path. She opened the door and paused for a brief second, her reflection catching in the window, not as a reminder of what had just happened, but as confirmation of who she was, who she had always been regardless of how she had been seen just minutes earlier. The distant hum of the city continued, unchanged, but for those who had stood in that parking lot, the silence between those sounds carried something new, something clearer. Daniel stepped toward the vehicle he would now enter not as the one in charge, but as someone being asked to answer. And as the door opened, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not in resistance, but in recognition that the moment he thought defined everything had actually revealed something far deeper, something he could not step away from. And as he finally moved forward, the space behind him closed, not with force, but with quiet certainty, leaving Ava Carter standing exactly where she belonged, not elevated, not changed, but seen. The door of the vehicle closed with a soft but final sound, not loud, not dramatic, yet it carried a weight that seemed to settle across the entire parking lot. Daniel Brooks sat inside now, his reflection faintly visible against the tinted glass, no longer framed by flashing lights and raised voices, but by silence, the kind of silence that forces a person to think, to replay every second, every decision, every moment that led here. Outside, the federal agents moved with quiet efficiency, exchanging brief words, documenting what had just occurred, their voices low, controlled, nothing wasted, because for them this was not chaos. It was procedure. Ava Carter remained by her vehicle for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the door, her gaze drifting across the space that had transformed so quickly. The crowd had begun to thin now, people stepping away slowly, some still glancing back, others already speaking into their phones, retelling what they had just witnessed, trying to capture it in words that would never quite match the weight of being there. One of the agents approached Ava again, his expression calm, respectful. "We will handle the report from here," he said, his tone steady. "But we may need a brief statement." Ava nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "Of course," she replied, her voice as composed as it had been from the beginning, unaffected by the shift in attention, unaffected by the validation that had followed, because none of it changed. Who she was, it only revealed it to those who had not seen it before. The rain began to ease, not stopping completely, but softening, the steady rhythm turning lighter, almost reflective, as if the environment itself was settling after the tension had passed. Daniel sat still inside the vehicle, his hands resting in front of him, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but quiet. His thoughts no longer racing outward, but turning inward, the certainty he once carried replaced by something else, something heavier, something that did not allow easy answers. He remembered the moment she showed the badge, the clarity of it, the calm in her voice, and then his own reaction, the dismissal, the laughter, the choice to ignore what was right in front of him. And now that moment played differently in his mind, not as control, but as a turning point. A point where everything could have shifted, where a single decision could have changed the entire outcome. But it did not, because he had already decided what to believe. Outside, Ava finally opened her car door and paused just before stepping in, her reflection catching once more in the glass, steady, grounded, unchanged, and for a brief second, she looked back toward the vehicle where Daniel sat, not to confront, not to revisit, but simply to acknowledge that the moment had reached its end. The agent nearby spoke again, coordinating the final steps, the paperwork, the follow-up, everything moving forward in a controlled, predictable way, the kind of order that returns after truth has been established. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in realization, the kind that does not come all at once, but settles slowly, piece by piece. He understood now that it was never about the car, never about the situation itself. It was about the assumptions he carried into it, the ones that shaped his actions before facts ever had a chance to matter. And now, sitting there, he could not escape that understanding, could not rewrite it, could only face it. Ava stepped into her vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, the engine starting with a low hum, steady, controlled, and as she prepared to leave, the last of the agents moved back toward their vehicles as well, the scene dissolving not with chaos, but with clarity. And as the cars began to pull away one by one, the parking lot returned to what it had been before, empty, quiet, but not unchanged, because moments like this do not disappear. They linger, not in the space itself, but in the people who were there, in the decisions made, in the lessons that cannot be ignored. And as Daniel remained seated, waiting for what came next, one truth stood clearer than anything else. Power was never about who raised their voice first. It was about who held the truth when everything else fell away. The last vehicle disappeared into the distance, its taillights fading into the dark, and with it went the noise, the tension, the urgency that had filled the parking lot just minutes ago, leaving behind a quiet that felt different from before, not empty, but reflective, the kind of silence that carries meaning. Daniel Brooks remained seated, the door still closed, the air inside the vehicle still, almost heavy. As if even the space around him understood that something had changed, he looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up through the windshield. The same parking lot now appearing unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because he had, or at least the way he saw it had shifted, every detail from earlier replayed again, but slower this time, clearer. The moment she stepped out of the car, the way she held herself, the calm in her voice, the badge he chose not to believe, and the laughter that followed, his laughter, the one thing that echoed the loudest now, not because of how it sounded, but because of what it meant. Outside, the rain had almost stopped, just a faint drizzle left, tapping lightly against the glass, steady, quiet, like a reminder that time had not paused for him, that everything continued whether he was ready or not. An agent opened the door beside him, not abruptly, not forcefully, just with purpose. "We are ready," he said, his tone even, and Daniel nodded, slowly stepping out, the air cooler now, the weight of the moment still present but no longer overwhelming, just real. As he stood there, he glanced once more toward where Ava Carter had been, but her car was gone, her presence no longer visible, and yet it remained, not physically, but in what she had left behind, the truth that had reshaped everything. The agent gestured toward the next vehicle, and Daniel followed, not because he was told to, but because there was no other direction left to take. The path forward had already been set by the choices he had made. As he reached the door, he paused briefly, just a second, long enough to take in the stillness around him, the absence of the crowd, the absence of noise, and in that quiet, something settled, not relief, not acceptance, but awareness, the kind that stays with a person long after the moment ends. He entered the vehicle, and the door closed again, softer this time, less final, more transitional. Inside, everything was calm, controlled, structured, a contrast to the chaos he had created earlier. But even here, the reality followed him, not in words, not in confrontation, but in understanding. Ava Carter drove through the city streets, her hands steady on the wheel, the rhythm of the road familiar, grounding, the lights passing by in a steady pattern, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just movement, just continuation. Her expression remained unchanged, not because the moment did not matter, but because it had never defined her. It had only revealed something that was already there, something that did not need validation, something that did not depend on how others saw it. And as she continued forward, the city carried on around her, unaware, unchanged, yet connected in ways most people would never see. Back in the vehicle, Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed ahead, not on the road, but on the space beyond it, the place where thoughts settle and questions begin. He understood now that what had happened was not just an incident, not just a mistake, but a reflection, a moment that exposed something deeper, something he could not ignore or explain away. And as the vehicle moved forward, carrying him into whatever came next, one truth remained clear, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. He had believed the badge gave him power, but in the end, it was the truth behind it that defined everything.